Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 201. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland. We have a centre in Inverness, one in Portree, one in Fort William, and one in Wick, looking after the historic documents of the Highlands of Scotland. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very, very grateful for that. So welcome to episode number 201. Thank you so much for all the feedback and comments and messages and emails and things about the 200th episode last week. It was really, really appreciated to see all the comments that came in during the episode, but also subsequent messages and comments of people who have enjoyed and taken part in the series over the last few years. So thank you very much for sending those to me. It was appreciated. So this week's episode, as I mentioned last week, is one that's been hanging over me as a subject which I knew I needed to cover and hadn't got round to yet. Something which changed the Highland landscape, which brought change to people's lives, and something which is a subject of huge fascination to a lot of people, and also something that is kind of really present in a lot of people's memories as well. We're looking at hydropower. I'm going to warn you straight off that science is not my thing. History, English, words, fine. Science, not quite so much. So I am going to start with a summary of what hydropower is and the ways that hydropower is generated and used in the UK. This is a description from the UK government website. Hydroelectric power is the energy derived from flowing water. This can be from rivers or from man-made installations where water flows from a high-level reservoir down through a tunnel and away from a dam. Turbines placed within the flow of the water extract its kinetic energy and convert that into mechanical energy. This causes the turbines to rotate at high speed, driving a generator that converts the mechanical energy into electrical energy. The amount of hydroelectric power generated depends on the water flow and the vertical distance, known as the head, that the water falls through. So I am entirely sure that many of you will be familiar with the process of hydroelectricity. I'm guessing some people might have worked in that industry or certainly have memories of the dam constructions. But this website, the government website, goes on to say there are 3 main types of hydroelectric schemes in use in the UK. 1. Storage schemes. In storage schemes, a dam impounds the water in a reservoir that feeds the turbine and generator that are usually located within the dam itself. 2nd, run-of-river schemes, which use the natural flow of a river where a weir can enhance the continuity of the flow. Both storage and run-of-river schemes can be diversion schemes, where water is channelled from a river, a lake, or a dammed reservoir to a remote powerhouse containing the turbine and the generator. And then finally, pumped storage incorporates 2 reservoirs. At times of low demand, generally at night, electricity is used to pump water from the lower to the upper basin. This water is then released to create power at a time when demand and price is high. Although not considered a renewable energy because of its reliance on electricity, pumped storage is very good for improving overall energy efficiency. And then finally, the UK, at the time this was written, which is about 10 years out of date now, but at the time this was written, the UK generated about 1.5% of its electricity from hydroelectric schemes, most of which are large-scale schemes in the Scottish Highlands. So as I say, that's slightly out of date and will have changed a little bit now, but while it's only a very small percentage of the UK's electricity by those stats that was generated through hydropower, almost all of that electricity from hydropower comes from hydro schemes in the Highlands. So we're a big part of its story, and it's a big part of our story. So why is that? Why has the Highlands always played a role in hydroelectricity? Well, it's not only because of obviously all our glorious rainfall, but also the amount of water in rivers, in lochs, and the fact that we have steep and high mountains for that water to run off. And so that's why the 1940s onwards particularly saw such a boom in hydroelectric developments in the area. But I'm going to start way before that. Now obviously we have known about the power and the force of water and the potential of using water for millennia. Water has always been manoeuvred and routed and moved to where it can serve the needs of a community in whatever way that is. But of course, for most of human history, we've had no electricity in the way that we think of it today. Electricity, which is basically the movement of electrons between atoms, has always been around. It's a natural phenomena, but it wasn't really until the late 1700s, early 1800s that people started to really understand the potential of what could be done if you harnessed that natural electricity and created more of it and used it to generate power that could be used to enhance everyday life. So in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we see famous names such as Benjamin Franklin, Michael Faraday, Alessandro Volta, all of these people and many others contributing to this emerging field of scientific learning and invention, and we start to see improvements coming in thick and fast. So we start to see the invention of electric batteries, electric light bulbs, loads of other things being developed over that period. But in addition to this, scientists were investigating, inventing, developing, discovering new ways of generating electricity and of transmitting it. And so through the 1800s, water turbines started to be developed. And in 1878, the world's first hydroelectric project was used to light one bulb in Cragside House in Northumberland. And I find that really, really interesting that, or really, you sort of look at it and go, that's a huge amount of work to generate the power for one bulb. But can you imagine the transformation that would have brought, that one bulb? The first hydroelectric project being used to light that one bulb. And then from there, hydroelectricity is on its way and it starts to develop at a pace from that 1870 period onwards. It starts with some small-scale private schemes. So we start to have private schemes where people use water power and harness that to generate electricity for their estate or their house. In the Highlands, the first use of hydroelectricity was in Fort Augustus. In 1890, the Abbey at Fort Augustus and the 800 or so people who lived in the village were supplied with power from a small 18 kilowatt power station. And again, it's quite remarkable to think that Fort Augustus, one village in the Highlands, had something supplied by this hydro scheme that nobody else in the Highlands had in the same way. Some of the large estate houses started to install private schemes through the 1890s and 1900s, and we start to see a few small public supply systems, little power stations starting to come in. There was one in Inverness, and I'll come back to that shortly. But in 1895, construction started on what would be the first major large-scale industrial use of hydroelectricity in Britain, and this was the aluminium smelter at Foyers. And creating this included the construction of a dam and reservoir above Foyers called Loch Moor, and this was created by merging Loch Garth and Loch Faralline. And the result of that was, of course, that the system was able to function, but also the loss of crofts which were submerged at Loch Garthside. And we hold some papers that talk about that, about the impact of these crofts being submerged and what consideration was made for that. So, for instance, croft number 29, Donald McGilvery. The major portion of this croft is on the north or upper side of the road. The extent of the croft is as listed underneath. Present area of arable, so it breaks down into arable land, pasture land, buildings, and so on. Then they work out how much would be lost to that croft by that croft if it was submerged, and then what the balance would be that the crofters would be left with, and therefore are they entitled to any kind of compensation. So for Donald McGilvery, it says, As this croft is not materially interfered with, and there is no land convenient and available for compensation, probably a money arrangement, either as a reduction of rent or a lump sum, would be the most satisfactory. Croft number 28, Widow Fraser. A considerable portion of this croft is on the north or upper side of the road, and the extent of the croft is as under listed. So it breaks it down into all the crofts, all the people affected. So there is some kind of compensation, but of course if that's been your home for however many years or decades. Croft number 26, Widow McLean. This croft is chiefly arable land and is partly on the north and partly on the south side of the road. It goes on, as usual, to give the extent and the loss by submergence, saying how much will be left of each of those types of land. If the suggestion is made above for Croft, the suggestion that is made for Croft 27 is carried out, it goes on to say that as compensation, we would suggest that a portion of Croft number 22, presently held by Donald Mackintosh, but which he gives up in exchange for other lands, should be added to this croft. So you see the huge impact that this is having on moving land about and what people are now entitled to as a result of this construction. So the scheme at Foyers, as I said, is the first major hydroelectric scheme in Britain. And it was the smelters, obviously that Foyers scheme was to power the aluminium smelter, and it was the smelters which really drove the hydroelectric industry forward for the next few years. You'll perhaps remember from a previous episode I've done a Learn with Lorna on the aluminium, but I've mentioned before that we have some fantastic collections of photographs showing the smelters development, both in our archive in Inverness and also in Lochaber. The Loch Leven Water and Electric Power Company was set up following a 1904 Act of Parliament, and this was because the Foyers smelter, the hydropower had been so successful that they then applied to set up the Loch Leven Water and Electric Power Company. And this act enabled British Aluminium to construct the Kinloch Leven hydroelectric scheme to power the Kinloch Leven aluminium smelter. And this particular scheme at Kinloch Leven included a large artificial reservoir, Blackwater, which was impounded by the longest gravity dam in the Highlands at 914 metres. The Kinloch Leven smelter opened in 1909, and it quickly became the producer of nearly a third of the world output of aluminium. Foyers, I believe, was around 1/6, so it's quite astonishing to think that these two plants on their own in the Highlands were generating such a proportion of world aluminium. I'm not going to talk about aluminium today, but that has happened because of hydroelectricity. Now, you might remember, if you've watched that Learn with Lorna on aluminium industry, that the third hydroelectric scheme, the Lochaber scheme, was built by the British Aluminium Company in Fort William in the 1920s. And this one involved raising the level of Loch Lagan, and it was the largest of BA's schemes. So by this point, they have these three major schemes in the Highlands. Now, British Aluminium's use of hydropower was influential. They had proved that large-scale schemes could generate substantial amounts of power, and that it was worthwhile. And it was that success that led to the development of hydroelectric schemes to provide public supplies of electricity, as opposed to just supplies for one specific industry. In the 1920s then, there were proposals to set up a hydroelectric scheme for Inverness. And they chose to use the site of the old Bucht Mill. So anyone familiar with Inverness will know that is not at all far from where the Archive Centre is now. It's just literally over the road. Now, incidentally, and this is a bit of a tangent, the original Bucht Mill, which was originally known as the Mill of Kilvane, was first recorded in 1232, and it was a meal mill, the other way around, a meal mill generated by water and then by steam. So there's been a long history on that site, as I've mentioned at the beginning, of harnessing and using and manoeuvring water to achieve what you need. But in 1923, the town council purchased that land from the Warrens of Bucht with the aim of creating a hydroelectric scheme that would give public supply to Inverness. They used the widened Old Mill Lade to supply water power from the River Ness using the flow down from the Wynn Park Lade. And again, if anyone knows Inverness, you'll be familiar with these little bits of water. The Town Council therefore set up a small 150 kilowatt hydroelectric station at the Bucht. And we hold in our archives in Inverness the souvenir programme of the official opening of the hydroelectric station at the Bucht, which was formally opened on the 11th of December 1929 by Sir Murdoch MacDonald, MP for Inverness-shire, and it was his engineering company that had carried out the construction. That project cost £15,000, and it was estimated at the time of opening that it would generate about 600,000 kilowatts of power per year, which would be enough to supply all the town's electricity needs from midnight to 7 a.m. in the winter and from 6 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. in the summer. So we're starting to see public schemes coming out. We've started with very small scale private estates and houses, then we've gone into a small village being able to have it, and then into the big factories of Foyers and Kinlochleven and so on. Now we're starting to see bigger public schemes. Further south, the Clyde Valley Company opened a hydro scheme in 1926, and then in 1930 and 1933 respectively, the Grampian Electricity Company, Supply Company, set up hydropower stations at Rannoch and at Tummel Bridge. And then in 1934, the Rossshire Electricity Supply Company was set up at Loch Loochart. So we're starting to see things really developing at a pace now from those initial discoveries and inventions. And at this period, in the 1930s, well, late 20s and 30s, people started to look at the Highlands with new questions. If this is the land of the mountain and the flood, if this is the land of rivers and lochs and mountains, and can we harness all of that water? Is this the ideal place where that resource that already exists can be utilised and shaped? But also, and with another perspective, can something be done to stem the depopulation of the Highlands? So between about 1920 and 1950, there had been a 15% drop in population of the Highlands. So it's becoming a resource-rich, in terms of water, resource-rich place, but with people leaving. So all of these questions are being asked of, is there a way we can tackle all of these things? So in the 1920s and 30s, various surveys were undertaken across the Highlands to try and identify potential locations for large hydro schemes, and also to estimate the possible output. And one report in 1938, they estimated, I don't even know how to say this number, they estimated that 1,972,000 million units could be generated per year in the Highlands. 1972 million units. So that was in 1938, where they're looking at the depopulation, they're looking at the resource in the Highlands, the potential for creating large-scale hydro dams. But of course, not long after that, life in the Highlands, along with everywhere else in the world, would be turned upside down by the outbreak of World War II. But what World War II brought was an increased need for power and electricity generation. So again, the Highlands comes into play. And in 1942, a report was published which recommended the construction of large hydro dams in the Highlands. And it was that report which led to the passing of the 1943 Hydroelectric Development Scotland Act and the creation of the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board. So if we've had that big change of industry from BA, British Aluminium, at the beginning, the next big landmark is this 1943 Act, which creates the Hydroelectric Board for the North of Scotland. And their remit was both to generate and to supply electricity throughout the north of Scotland, and to coordinate the development of new hydro schemes and to sell on any surplus power that was made. Now, the first schemes that the board was proposed were met with fierce controversy and opposition. Various reasons for that. People felt that tourism would be severely damaged if beauty sites were ripped up and industrialised. There were environmental concerns fears of pollution and ecological damage. There was concern as well that perhaps the schemes would be so successful that heavy, dirty industry would move into the Highlands on a big scale and change everything. And there was also a really strong feeling, notably from Evan Barron of the Inverness Courier and various others, that anything that was created using Highland resource should benefit the Highlands before it benefited anybody else. And all of this debate and all of this discussion and opposition meant that really very little was done in the first year or two. And the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board's first chairman, Lord Airlie, resigned in 1946 because so little was changing. But he was replaced by Tom Johnston, and he had been chosen as Secretary of State for Scotland in Churchill's wartime coalition government. He was a strong, determined, patriotic, left-wing Labour politician, and he is the man who is credited with being the driving force behind the success of the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board. And it was under his leadership that the board's first major scheme at Sloy near Loch Lomond was undertaken, opening in 1950. And incidentally, he also received the Freedom of Inverness for his work in providing hydroelectricity for the Highlands. In 1948, along with lots of other big momentous things that happened in 48, like the foundation of the NHS and all sorts of other things, electricity supply was nationalised. And in the north of Scotland, all local authority schemes and all private schemes and stations were brought under the control of the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board, requiring them to not only build and oversee new schemes, but also to amalgamate all those that already existed into one system. And we hold loads of records to do with this, to do with the work of the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board over the next 30 years. Their acronym is NOSHEB, by the way, which I always feel is just not the nicest sounding acronym. But we hold loads of records to do with what they achieved over the next 30 years. We hold the papers and photographs of Sir William Halcrow and Partners, civil engineers, which really illustrate the scale of some of these projects. We hold the papers and reports of Sir Murdoch MacDonald and Partners, who were engineers who worked out of Inverness. The papers of E. Murdoch, who is one of the Halcrow engineers. And these papers, and amongst others, include hundreds of construction photos and progress photos, as well as reports, notebooks, maps and plans, gauge reading books, publications, all sorts of other things. And I photographed many of them to, as you now know from the 200th episode, how I do my research. I photographed hundreds of these to write up my notes. But as I was doing it, I thought many of them will be quite dull for me to read out, so like gauge reading books of what the weather's like and how much rainfall there is. Or they'll be too visual for me to try and describe them. But if you search hydro in any of our Facebook page, you'll be able to go back and see some of these pictures. But instead I thought I would go a little bit left field and share with you some extracts from letters from a small private collection, which just illustrates the way that the scheme's potential, what hydropower could possibly bring, was viewed by an ordinary person in the Highlands in the 1940s. These letters were written in 1944 by R.A. Smith of Ballafairy Lane, Inverness, to his son Captain John Smith, who was on active service in the Second World War, but who was in search of a job to come home to when he was demobilised. So this one, the 10th of October 1944. My dear John, yours of the 27th ult, which I was very pleased to get and pleased to hear that you keep well and in good health and spirits. We are all very well, and with one thing and another kept quite busy, or at least it gives one that idea. I was very interested in what you propose to do after you're demobilised, and I consider that you're doing the right thing in trying to get into the North of Scotland hydroelectric scheme, which has every appearance of being a big concern. If there's anything I can do to help you, I will certainly do everything I can, but I'm afraid it will be very little that I can do to help. When I got your letter, I went direct to Sir Murdoch's office in the High Street. He's in London, and he won't be back in Inverness for a couple of weeks yet. But I left word that I wanted to see him as soon as he returned. I then had a talk with Mr. Stewart, and he is also going to take up the matter with Sir Murdoch. Lord Lovat, I learn, is in London at present and will not be north for some little time, but I'll make a point of seeing him as soon as I can, and I have the idea that he might be very helpful to you as well. I quite understand your feeling about the provost, and I don't wonder at you, but at the same time, he is a member of the committee dealing with the hydroelectric scheme, and he might be very useful later on. So I wonder what he thought of the provost. Then about 2 weeks later, though, the 26th of October, my dear John, Sir Murdoch has just returned from London, and I've had an interview with him regarding the matter you wished me to discuss. He will be very ready to help you as far as he possibly can, but he has some doubts whether his word will have any effect in the meantime. So this is at the point where the schemes are being proposed, but there's still controversy, and it's not happening so far. He went very fully into the whole question of hydroelectric schemes, and although he's a very strong supporter of the scheme, there are certain difficulties which he is opposed to, and until those questions are cleared out of the way, little progress can be made with the scheme. I told him about your qualifications as an electrical engineer, and he said he would do everything he could to help you. He pointed out that it would be some considerable time before the board would be able to commence operations, and the first few years would naturally be taken up with surveying and dam construction. Possibly it would be some time before electrical engineers would be required. But he went on to say that it would be best if you were to put your application yourself direct to the secretary of the board and state that you are a native of Inverness and well acquainted with the area, as well as sending your qualifications. He also said he'll take a copy of the application and send it on to the chairman, with whom he is very friendly. So he goes on to say that, he will do absolutely anything he can. And then at the end of November, we have the final letter relating to this that says, there's one more which I'll come back to. I've had a meeting with Sir Murdoch because the son has sent the qualifications, sent a full application, and the father has gone in again to meet the engineers behind the project. I've added a PS on his advice that the applicant holds the Faraday House diploma and is an associate member of the Institute of Electrical Engineers and is looking for employment after finishing at the end of the war. So he will do everything he can. He will do his best for you. If there's anything else I can do to help you, please let me know. And letters were sent to Lord Airlie and the board, and replies received to state that they would be sure to remember him as the project progressed. And the reason I shared that rather than reading out to you the gauge readings or the kind of technical specifications of the annual reports and things like that is because I think it gives a good sense of the possibilities that this project might bring to Highlanders if it was managed properly. And of course we know that Airlie would resign not that long after that. But there's a feeling in those letters that this is a thing that's going to take off, and if you can get in at the start, you'll be in a good place. And it did take off, and it was big. Of course, after those initial, I mentioned those were initial concerns around tourism and pollution and making sure that the resources were allocated back into Highland. But after those initial concerns were mostly overcome, development sped up. And one important concession, which was put in place to allay those fears about the damage that the schemes could do, a concession was that the Act required the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board to preserve scenic attractions, to build salmon ladders to allow the salmon to bypass the dams and get to their spawning grounds, and also to build salmon hatcheries. But as I say, at this point, it takes off on quite a major scale. And in total, the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board oversaw the construction of 8 large schemes in addition to several smaller ones. Here are some statistics for you which I thought were extraordinary. Over 186 miles of tunnels were excavated, and about the same amount in aqueducts and other infrastructure like that. Around 20,000 miles of cabling was connected, both on land and underwater. 78 dams were built in the Highlands and 54 primary power stations. And just an enormous undertaking, not just in the Highlands, but further afield, but most of it in the Highland area. 20,000 miles of cabling. Electricity, because of these constructions, was distributed across the north of Scotland and to the larger islands. And the work at these schemes in Afric, Beaulieu, at Shin, at Connan, the Great Glen, and various other hydroelectric schemes. The work was incredibly labour intensive, brutal, heavy, exhausting work, cold and wet, and in rural parts of the country that were hard to get to, where people had to go away from family to work, if they had family, to go away to work. The memories of the men who worked on the dam construction, they talk about the cold, about the pouring rain, because of course that's the reason the dams are being built there, because there's water and there's this power of resource. But to work in those conditions is incredibly hard. And at the height of this construction of these North of Scotland hydroelectric schemes in the late 1940s, early 1950s, there were around 12,000 people working on hydro schemes, including large numbers of prisoners of war from Germany and from Italy. The work was difficult and dangerous, and people lost their lives in the construction of the dams. But after the war ended, wages were high, and the work attracted not only a British workforce, but also people from a wide variety of countries. So there were Poles, there were Czechs, other nationalities who came because they could bring extensive knowledge of tunnelling, expertise in dam building and other things. And many of these workers lived in temporary camps, several thousand men at a time. And these were often rough and dangerous places to live. And you can imagine the huge influx of 2,000 people coming to a place. It reminded me a little bit of the gold mining camps in Sutherland of the previous century. Fighting's common, drinking's common, because there's nothing else to do. I was absolutely fascinated to learn from regular Learn with Lorna viewer Fiona Newton that her father was a civil engineer with Sir Alexander Gibb and partners, who were consultants on the Connan Basin hydroelectric scheme. And she told me that he worked on the construction of hydro schemes as well as a whole load of other really interesting projects. So he played his role, but also that Fiona's mother was a doctor who worked in one of the workers' camps. And she said that she was brought up with a huge number of stories from both parents about what the hydro schemes meant. So I'm really looking forward to getting some of those records in from Fiona and hearing a little bit more about those stories. The first of the stations to be completed by the board before the big, I mentioned there was one of the big schemes opened in 1950, but the first one they completed was a small underground station near at the Falls of Morar. And the turbines were started in December 1948 by the widow of a local crofter. And she said the words, "Let light and power come to the crofts." And that's what happened. Gradually, power spread across the Highlands and further afield, thanks to these enormous civil engineering undertakings. And the hydro schemes changed the Highlands forever. Landscapes changed, lives changed, some for worse, but many for better. And the dams, the power stations, the aqueducts, the tunnels, all of those remain, or many of those remain, as functioning testaments to those who designed them and those who built them, and as I said, some of who lost their lives doing so. And many of them, ironically, now, considering the controversy at the beginning, many of them are much loved tourist attractions. So for instance, the dam at Pitlochry with the salmon ladder is a very popular place for people to visit. But I found it interesting to start with that very big, that one light bulb that was powered through hydropower, and then those small schemes, the Fort Augustus, the smelter, the Inverness public scheme, up to these enormous hydroelectric schemes, which now generate the vast majority of hydroelectric power that comes to the UK, comes out of these schemes. I only had half an hour to talk about it, so I have done a very quick overview of the history of hydropower. But if you want to learn more than the very basics that I've been able to cover here, then I would suggest reading Peter Payne's book, The Hydro, along with Jim Miller's, I've got that one here, The Dam Builders. Peter Payne's book, The Hydro, talks about the kind of the legislation, the process of construction and so on. Jim's book talks about the men who built the dams and the impact it had on their lives and what working conditions were like. So together the two of those make a really good overview of hydroelectricity. The other one is Emma Wood's The Hydro Boys. But I'm going to finish with a very short extract from a booklet, Power from the Glens, which was produced by Scottish and Southern Energy. This is a recent publication, but I wanted to finish by reading one paragraph from it. By the 1960s, the face of the Highlands had changed forever. New dams headed new or larger lochs. Rivers had been diverted through aqueducts and underground tunnels, and power stations had been settled on loch sides. Electricity lines on steel pylons and wooden poles distributed electricity to remote settlements and individual crofts, bringing the power from the glens into people's houses. Life would never be the same again. I just thought that was a stunning little extract. Okay, like I say, a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it's made you want to go and find out a little bit more. If you've got memories of the schemes, Jen, I saw your comment there about people going out to Australia and New Zealand to settle. Please do share them and I'll pick them up afterwards. But in the meantime, thank you for joining me. I hope you can join me next week. We'll be looking at Tales from Granton for next week's episode. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highlands is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are really grateful for that. Thank you very much.